hear me loud and clear and see me on the screen. While we go through that, I want to welcome you first and foremost. We are so appreciative of you taking your time to join us today. We've got a packed full agenda of some great best practices, thought leaders, operations specialists, digital transformation thought leaders as well. So with that, we do have our registration for tomorrow's session down right below my floating head here. And then the chat box is where you can ask any questions. If you were able to join us for our pre-session, you'll know that Eric and team likes to answer questions on screen. Our team will be aggregating those questions for our Q&A later today. So please feel free to be interactive with each other and your speakers on screen. Today, we'll be covering a variety of different topics. Eric is going to kick us off with some industry trends, and then we'll move to Marcus Harris, who is our legal specialist, who will talk about some of digital transformation's failures from a legal perspective and point of view. And then we'll move to Stuart Robb, who will go over some new frontiers in digital transformation. He'll talk about AI and machine learning. Stuart is on our UK team, so all of you that are in the UK, he will be your point of contact for our third stage group. And then we'll do some executive summaries, and then go into managing people. During this conference, we'll talk a lot about change management and what that means as far as its relationship and importance to digital transformation. And then we will end today's session with building a world-class technology operation with Dave Beldick, our specialist. And then after, we will have a more informal live music and then Q&A with Eric to end the day. So we'd love to get to know you to start before I turn it over to Eric. So if you could put where you're from and the industry you work in the chat box, that way we can make sure that we are crafting our content to be most relevant to you. If you have any questions throughout the event, please feel free to click on the Ask a Question icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer it right away. So with that, I'm beyond excited to pass it over to Eric. Eric, as many of you know, is a main influencer in the digital transformation space. He's an ERP specialist, a software specialist. He's a world-renowned speaker, author, and then YouTube star as well, as we all know. So with that, I will turn it over to him to take us through industry trends for future digital transformations. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, thanks, Skylar, and thanks everyone for joining today. Appreciate everyone who's taken the time out of their schedules to be here for our annual Digital Stratosphere conference. As Kyler mentioned, my name is Eric Kimberling. She may have oversold me a little bit there. I don't know that I'm quite a YouTube star, world-renowned. Yeah, you are in marketing, so I guess that is your so thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate all the attendance, and like Kyler said, if you have questions along the way or there's anything you want me to address, that little chat function I'm watching as we go here, as people are chatting where they're from. It looks like we've got people all over the world, from the US where we're at. We've got people in the UK, Greece, Brazil, all over the world, Norway. So I appreciate everyone who's joining, especially at strange hours of the day for many of you. So I really appreciate you being here. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about transformation trends. And this is really an intent. The intent of this session is to open up the discussion and to really set the context for what we're going to be discussing through the remainder of the 3 days that we're here. And what we generally do in this session too is set the context of sort of a 20,000-foot flyover view of what are some of the challenges that organizations face, and what are those big trends that organizations should be aware of as you all embark on your transformation. So I'm sharing my slides here. Please thumbs up if you can see it, or thumbs down if you can't see it, because my intent is to be sharing it right now. And you should see a title slide here. So let me know. Kyler, are you seeing that okay? All right. So it looks like
looks great, Eric.
All right. All right. We're up and running. Good. So what we'll talk about today, just in this first session, we've got about 45 minutes or so to cover these topics. I'm going to give a quick overview of third stage, as well as an introduction to myself, a little bit about my background. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about digital transformation utopia and this grand vision that many organizations have, and rightfully so, for what they want their organizations to be and how they want their transformations to evolve over time. And then we'll talk about some of those transformation challenges that organizations face getting to that utopia state. And then finally, the meat of the presentation, we'll get to trends to consider in the 2020s, things that you should be aware of and watching for, and the types of technologies and things that you should be aware of as you're planning your digital strategy and roadmap for the coming years. So just to start, though, a bit about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. We're an independent transformation consulting firm. So we help clients throughout the world with their transformation journeys. We help with software evaluation and selection. We help with implementation, project management, organizational change management, which is where I grew up, or the space that I came up in the world of consulting. And we also do quite a bit of expert witness work. So when we talk about some of the things we're going to talk about later related to case studies and lessons learned from failure, a lot of that background and knowledge comes from our experience as expert witnesses. So that's a bit about the services we provide at a high level. And I think that the two main things to note about our company are that we're independent and 100% technology agnostic, so we're not aligned with any software vendors or system integrators. Our job is to help clients, regardless of the type of technology, through their transformation journeys. And the other thing that's always worth pointing out is we tend to take a business-first approach to consulting. So we don't lead with technology. We don't try to force technology where it doesn't belong or where it doesn't fit. We typically will start with your business needs or the client's business needs and define a strategy and roadmap from there. We have offices throughout the world. We're based in the United States. That's where Kyler and I are today. We also have offices in London as well as Brisbane, Australia. And you're going to hear from some of our team in both of those locations as well. So regardless of where in the world you are, or if you've got international operations, we have the team to support you in your transformations. I mentioned a little bit about our services already, but the main things we do, as I mentioned, are software evaluation and selection and the whole digital strategy and roadmap process, as well as the implementation, program management, change management, and business process improvement as well. So the name Third Stage, it's a rocket launch analogy, which alludes to the first two stages of a rocket would typically be the boosters that would get a rocket into space. And then you'd have a third stage launch that would get the rocket up to its ultimate height and speed. And I always thought that was a good analogy for transformations because they're so hard to overcome the gravity and inertia. And most companies tend to struggle or fail in their initiatives as a result of that. So our goal as an organization, and even in the content we're sharing here today, is how do we help you realize that third stage of success? How do we help you get past those first two stages that most organizations get stuck in? And what are those best practices and things you can be doing better to reach that third stage of success? So that'll be, a key theme that you'll hear throughout the 3 days, certainly today's opening sessions, as well as the next 2 days as well. What can we be doing? What are those best practices and lessons we can be taking to our teams and our organizations to make sure we reach that third stage of success? And the other background point of the name Third Stage, if any of you are classic rock buffs like I am, it also comes from the name of Boston's third album, the band from the late 70s, early 80s. Their third album was called Third Stage, and that's actually where I really got the idea for the name. But they themselves named it after a rocket launch analogy, and I stole the idea from them. So in full transparency, that's where the name originated. But if you're a classic rock fan, hopefully you can appreciate that reference as well. Some of the clients we've worked with over the years are quite a variety of different organizations: manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, financial services, nonprofits, retail, all sorts of different types of organizations. Oil and gas, that's another area we're doing quite a bit of work in lately, as well as construction. So a lot of different industries. I would also consider us industry agnostic in addition to being technology agnostic. That's a big differentiator for us, is that breadth of background and experience in helping a variety of clients through their transformations. And we also work with clients of all different sizes. We have some clients that are 5 to 10 million in annual revenue, but we have some clients that are 25 to 30 billion in annual revenue. most clients are somewhere in between, but we pride ourselves on being able to scale our service offering and our support up or down, depending on, the size of the organization and just what the needs and competencies are for that particular organization. So with that being said, I want to jump right into the content here. And like I said, if any point while I'm talking, I'm going to keep watching the chat box here, and Kyler may interrupt me at any point and ask questions that come in on your behalf. And if you're listening, we're actually multi-streaming this to a couple different platforms. If anyone's watching this on LinkedIn or YouTube, we'll keep an eye on that as well to see any comments or questions you might have there. And if you are watching on LinkedIn or YouTube, we encourage you or invite you to come over to Crowdcast, where a majority of the people are, but certainly welcome you to watch whatever platform you prefer. And we're also streaming to Facebook as well. So I want to jump into this whole concept of digital transformation utopia. And this is, I think a problem and opportunity at the same time. And I'll describe what I mean by that here before we get into sort of the big trends and the big things to be aware of and thinking about as you plan your transformation journey for the next several years. And when we look at digital transformation in general and what it is, I'm actually going to talk in a session later today. There's another session I'll be talking more about unpacking what digital transformation is and how to make it successful, and sort of that executive level summary of what it takes to make a transformation successful. But in the meantime, just to start, I want to talk a little bit about what are some of those big technologies, those common technologies that are out there that can drive or enable a digital transformation. For some organizations, they think of digital transformation as, I'm just going to go find a back office ERP system and replace my financial and inventory management system. That's perfectly fine. But there's also organizations that might look at it from a CRM or sales perspective, or an HCM and human capital perspective. But in addition to those, call it the more typical enterprise technologies, you also have a number of emerging technologies and more cutting edge technologies that are in some cases being integrated into ERP and CRM and HCM and supply chain management technologies and things of that nature. But they're also standalone technologies as well, best of breed types of solutions that are addressing many of these types of technologies that you see listed here. And actually later today, I think 2 sessions from now, Stuart Robb from our UK office, who actually heads up our UK office, is going to talk more about some of these emerging technologies in a lot more detail. So I'm not going to dive into what blockchain is, or how cybersecurity can be applied to your initiative, although we have another session on cybersecurity that'll be happening tomorrow. But instead, I wanted to just highlight the fact that there's a lot of technology out there, a lot of opportunities to use technology to enable improvements, to automate your business, to drive efficiency. And when you look at these options, there's certainly a lot of upside opportunity, but it's also can be very overwhelming, and it can be hard to make a decision of what it is we should do, what's right for our organization, what do we really need, how mature are these technologies really relative to what we want or need and what our risk profile is. And so the whole plethora of options out there can make it opportunistic, and it's exciting, and there's a lot of great visionary types of things we can be doing in our transformation. But at the same time, it can be overwhelming, and the gap or the magnitude of change to get to these states of utopia, as I called it earlier, can be very difficult, and that magnitude of change can be very significant. So that's one of the main challenges that organizations oftentimes face is trying to navigate all of those different options. And when we think about what are those pitfalls, what are those roadblocks or obstacles that prevent us from getting to that utopia? We look at things like artificial intelligence and all the opportunities that could bring to our organization. That's a great vision to set, but then we have to back up and look at where are we today, and what is that gap, and how do we close that gap? And that's where a lot of organizations struggle. The technology is there in many cases, although in many cases, as we'll talk throughout these sessions, in many cases, the technology is not quite mature or mature enough for some organizations, but the opportunity is there. The technology is out there, and there's a lot of different options. And so the challenges that organizations often face are things like the flawed perception that transformation is going to be easy, cheap, and fast. With emerging new technologies, exciting technologies, improved technologies, comes an unrealistic expectation that is somehow going to be a silver bullet to our organization. And therefore, it must be easy, cheap, and fast to implement if it's going to be a silver bullet for our organization. And that's a flawed assumption that a lot of organizations get trapped in. And so we have to figure out, how can we add that dose of reality and have our eyes wide open going into our transformation. Organizations more often than not underestimate the magnitude of risk and change. Not only the risk and change that's required to get to that state of utopia or that long-term vision that they're aiming for, but their own tolerance for risk. That's one of the first things we do in working with organizations is really assessing what is the risk profile, what's the risk tolerance of this organization, and what's the right roadmap and the right future state vision for this organization based on who they are and who they're trying to become. For example, we work with a lot of family-owned businesses, second or third generation family-owned businesses that are, relatively risk adverse. They don't, they have a lot to learn or a lot to lose, I should say, in terms of taking on risk. There's obviously family dynamics involved and other organizational, personal dynamics. And so there tends to be a sort of risk aversion that comes along with that. And that's perfectly fine. That's not a right or wrong assessment, but it's a matter of saying, okay, based on the cultural profile of this organization, what is the right roadmap for them? And that's probably going to look a lot different than a startup that is swinging for the fences, that can take on a huge amount of risk and feel perfectly comfortable with it. So that's really understanding and assessing the magnitude of risk and change and being realistic about it is very important. And then the failure to address the human component of transformation is another big pitfall that we see. And that's a common theme you're going to hear throughout the entire conference, especially when I'm speaking, just because I tend to think about things from a change management first perspective. And then there's also the organizational misalignment component of things. More often than not, organizations struggle or fail in their implementations, not because of anything that's necessarily wrong with the technology or even with the project management or the way the project's being run. Oftentimes it's a deeper, more foundational, fundamental problem related to alignment or lack thereof. And so organizations that can't agree at the top, for example, at the top levels of the organization, they can't agree on who they are and what they want to be when they grow up, and they haven't set a clear vision for that going into a transformation. Those headwinds and the friction that creates is going to undermine the potential success of the project. So those are some of the things to be aware of or thinking about, and those are some of the common challenges that prevent organizations from reaching that state of utopia. So what I want to talk about now are, how do we navigate some of those common transformation challenges in the 2020s and beyond? As we think about our digital strategy roadmap and overall plan for the coming years, what are those challenges we face and how do we overcome them? And then once we get past this section, then I want to dive more into some of the trends to be aware of and some of the trends to be thinking about or watching for in the industry. So first is to understand transformation success versus failure. I mean, I'm not going to read all of these bullets here, and it may be a bit hard to read depending on how you're consuming this content right now. But I'll summarize to say that a lot of the issues caused by failure are related more to people and processes rather than technology itself. Technology certainly can create challenges, especially in today's day and age where the technology is changing so quickly that in some cases it's not as mature as it needs to be for some organizations. But largely the problems that organizations face and the failure points that they face are related to people and processes. And so we have to think about, what are those common human and business process issues that organizations face and how can we overcome them? And we're actually going to talk a lot more about this when Marcus Harris speaks later today. Marcus from Taft Law, he's going to be talking about lessons from failure. So I'll let him dive into this in a bit more detail, but I want to sort of scratch the surface or give you a preview of some of the themes that you'll be hearing when he speaks later today. But that's the key, is that the failure points are often related to people and processes. In some cases, it's related to project management and the overall governance and controls. And then when we look at the projects that succeed, that's more often than not going to be a bit more related to people and processes as well. So when you look at why do the successful projects that we've worked with, how does that compare to the failures or the challenge projects that hire us to come clean up their projects? What's the difference? And you can oftentimes point that or point to some of the people and process issues. The other big failure points, whenever someone asks me to really narrow it down a bit more, if I have to take this slide and say, give me one or two bullet points of why projects fail or succeed, and let's get to the root cause of what it is. A lot of these things listed here on this slide are symptoms of even deeper root causes, which, if I had to summarize that, would be one of the things I mentioned before, which is alignment, which is if we're not aligned as an organization, as a team, we don't have a clear vision of where we're headed and what this transformation means to us and how it's going to support our business processes and our strategy going forward, then it's going to be very difficult to succeed. So alignment or lack thereof is a root cause of success and failure. And then the second thing I would say to summarize the root cause of success or failure is the level of realistic expectations. So when you look at organizations that have unrealistic expectations, oftentimes that's a root cause that leads to a lot of the things you see in red over here on the left side of your screen. So for example, if I go into a project and I think it's going to take me 12 months to go through an entire implementation and say $1 million or whatever it is, I draw a line in the sand, I get board approval, everyone's aligned on this 12-month, $1 million sort of parameter. But then I get into the project and quickly realize, oops, I need a lot more time than 12 months and I need a lot more money than $1 million if I'm going to do this right. But oftentimes we've already gotten the approval. It is what it is. And now we've got to work within those confines. And so we end up backing into an unrealistic number, which entails oftentimes cutting things that shouldn't be cut. So we cut corners, we skimp, we cut out change management, we cut that extra cycle or two out of our testing process, whatever the case may be. And it leads us into the snowball effect that then leads to a lot of these symptoms you see on this slide. So if I had to summarize two things to do to be successful or to avoid failure, it would be to make sure that you're aligned as an organization. You take the time up front to get that alignment. And we're going to talk more about that in some of the other sessions here this week. And then the second thing is to make sure you have realistic expectations and recognize that when you get proposals from software vendors and system integrators, you are being sold. You're not being set realistic expectations you are being sold to. So you have to take it with a grain of salt and assume that the assumptions are overly optimistic, and we've got to figure out how to make this a little bit more realistic for us as an organization. And so, the other part of this too is as we think about how do we get to that utopia, how do we navigate some of these trends in the industry, how do we get, from where we are today and where, that long-term future state is. And maybe we're thinking 5 or 7 or 10 years out, and that's okay. We're not going to get there overnight, but we can at least set a vision or a path of how we're going to get there. One of the key first steps is to make sure that we have a clear strategy defined up front. So a clear digital strategy and roadmap and a clear understanding of what it is we need to accomplish. And when we look at digital strategies and roadmaps for our clients, there's really 6 major buckets or work streams that we focus on. And you can see listed on the left side of the screen here. Business process management is the first one, where we look at, what are our business processes today? What do we want them to look like in the future? And this is a really important one that gets back to that whole alignment discussion. We need to be aligned on what we want our operations to be going forward. It's a very flawed and dangerous assumption to assume that the technology is somehow going to answer that question for you or help you define that, because it's not. It may help you define how a screen is going to look or how a little, micro workflow is going to work within, transactions, but it's not going to answer the big picture questions for you of how your processes should flow, what they should look like. And you really need to have that alignment and definition before you start spending money on system integrators and expensive consultants and buying software that you're not ready for, that sort of thing. So business process management is the first workflow or work stream. And then organizational change management, which I will always argue is the most important one, making sure that you assess the organization and have a clear change strategy and plan early in your transformation roadmap. If there's one critical path thing that's likely to slow down your project, it's change management. So you can never start change management too early. And I rarely use absolutes, but this is a case where I will say you can never start it too early. I've yet to meet anyone, even on our own consulting teams, who said, we started change management too early. We should have waited a while before we got into change management. It's usually quite the opposite. People feel like they should have started sooner. And even when we're involved in a change initiative for a client or a change management initiative, you still constantly have that feeling of we could have done a little bit more. If we had that extra time, that extra focus on change management, that only would have helped us. So I think having that focus early as possible is important. And then you have the enterprise application or technology piece, which is that third work stream, which is where, how do we navigate all these different options we have in the market and find the technology that's best for us? Solution architecture, how do we tie these different technologies together? Even if we're implementing a core ERP system that presumably will handle most of our business functions, how do we tie that to other third-party legacy systems or other bolt-ons that we might need? So that solution architecture piece is very important. And then business intelligence and analytics. How do we use data to report and provide information that we can do to make better decisions and better understand the situation or the operational situation that we're in, and really leveraging that data from our systems to do that. And then finally, project quality assurance. That's something that starts during the strategy phase and should continue all the way through your transformation, which is just making sure you've got the right governance and controls in place, the right risk mitigation factors, that sort of thing. So this whole section here is really intended to think about, we've got this future state, we've got this vision of all these cool technologies out there that we could be deploying in our organization. There's a big gap from where we are today to getting to that future state. How do we close that gap? How do we navigate that whole journey and get past those pitfalls, mitigate the risk, all that good stuff? And that's really what I intended to focus on here first, before getting back to the future state. You know, what are some of those trends? What are some of those cool technologies and things that we should be thinking about as we are transforming our organizations? So what I want to do here, and again, I'm starting to dip into or setting the stage or preview what Stuart Robb is going to talk about here. I believe it's in about an hour and a half. He'll be going on to talk about some of the emerging technologies in the technology space. And what I want to do, though, is just touch on a few themes or common things that we are seeing, and ERP vendors and enterprise technology vendors are focused on. So I want to touch on a few of those here today, just to give you some sense of what are some of the things that we should be thinking about as we think about that future state of Utopia. We're going to talk throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of the week of how do we get there? You know, what are the steps we need to do to get to that future state? But for now, I want to talk about that vision, that long-term vision of what the different types of technologies are out there, and what some of the trends are that we're seeing in the marketplace right now. So first is the acceleration of cloud adoption. This has been, a trend that's been happening for several years now, close to a decade. There were, software vendors in the early 2000s that were first coming onto the scene with sort of cloud only offerings. So you had systems or vendors like NetSuite, Salesforce, et cetera, that really started, and built their whole system in the cloud. So they were always in the cloud to begin with. That's one of the things is that the cloud adoption that is something we're seeing more of. Software vendors that are native in the cloud, as well as now traditionally on-premise systems are some of the on-premise systems are. Sorry, 1 second. I'm having a technical issue here. There we go. Sorry about that. So some of the even the on-premise vendors are moving to the cloud. They're moving their on-premise systems to the cloud as we speak, and this has only been accelerated by this. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, sorry about that. So some of many of the vendors are moving in that direction, and what's important to recognize, though, is that so many of the vendors are not quite there yet in terms of maturity in moving their products to the cloud. So while vendors like NetSuite and Salesforce, for example, they grew up in the cloud, they've always been in the cloud, their products are relatively mature. They may or may not be a good fit for your organization or your needs, but the product itself is mature in the cloud because they've always been there, for a good 20 years or so. Now, when you look at software vendors like SAP and Oracle, Microsoft, some of the big ERP enterprise-wide software providers that are just now migrating their on-premise systems to the cloud, those are the vendors that are not quite as mature as others. And that's where you really have to look at the maturity of the product and the capabilities and the functions to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting and what you're not getting, because there's a lot of gaps and a lot of holes in these systems as they're migrating to the cloud. So despite the fact that there's a lack of maturity in many cases for a lot of these software vendors, that cloud adoption rate is accelerating. Software vendors are aggressively moving to the cloud quickly, whether any of us like it or not. That's where software vendors are headed for the most part. And so I think the key there is to recognize, some of the things that software vendors don't necessarily want you to know, and they're not necessarily going to come out and say it, but their products aren't mature in many cases. There's a lot of capabilities missing. The other thing, if you want to be frank and brutally honest, is that cloud solutions oftentimes are better for vendors than they are for customers because they make more money. It's constant, steady, subscription-based revenue. And vendors hate when I say this, and I apologize to any of the vendors that are on the session today or listening in, but cloud solutions typically cost more in the long term than on-premise. Even when you factor in infrastructure costs and the cost of maintenance, the reality is once you get to that year 5 or 7, you tend to see a increase in cost longer term, just because that annual subscription cost isn't going away. At least with on-prem, you had that big upfront capital cost, and then you have that small ongoing maintenance fee, but it's a lot like leasing versus buying a car. At some point you pay it off and you end up with the technology and you own it, for better or for worse. So I think that's a big thing to be aware of, is that you're probably going to spend more in a cloud environment. It may be a better answer for you. It may give you more flexibility. It may be a better fit. It's going to keep you on the cutting edge of R&D and some of the software and technological capabilities. And that's a whole nother story on the benefit side. But on the cost side, that's something to be aware of. So that cloud adoption is increasing largely because the vendors want it to be increasing. And there certainly is advantages, certainly to organizations that are adopting to the cloud as well. And the other thing I'll note too about cloud adoption is that the cloud adoption rate has actually accelerated pretty dramatically in this COVID world. So just in the last 12 months or so, as organizations have been forced to deal with semi-remote workforces or partially remote hybrid workforces, as they've had to deal with global disparate supply chains, as they've had to deal with some of these more complex business processes and things that have been a byproduct of the COVID world, that has really fast-tracked cloud adoption as well. And it's really exposed organizations that are on premise. It's really exposed some of the weaknesses of that sort of infrastructure, because it's a lot more difficult to manage a remote workforce when you have an on-premise system and people are trying to access the system remotely. So that's really fast-tracked the cloud adoption rate as well. And I think at some point, the word cloud and cloud adoption may be a moot point, because I think eventually will just be where technology is, and that it just is the preferred backbone for many organizations going forward, most likely. Another trend to be thinking about here is this whole concept of machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's a fascinating buzzword. It's been around for quite some time, but it's just now starting to seep into call it the mainstream. And when I say mainstream, I mean, mainstream ERP enterprise technology vendors. So, companies like SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, they're actively looking at ways to leverage artificial intelligence, machine learning to enable better optimized business processes, to enable predictive analytics, or enable future types of capabilities or things that might be happening in the future. That whole machine learning and AI concept is just now starting to break into the mainstream. And just to give you an example, or maybe a use case of where sort of a micro process where you're starting to see it is, some vendors are starting to work AI and machine learning into commodity processes and redundant processes like, for example, accounts payable processing. So for processing invoices, and we had a human that was manually looking at every single invoice that came in and approving it or not, or rejecting it. Now you have machine learning processes and capabilities that can automate that to where the human now focuses on exceptions. So anything that falls outside certain thresholds or doesn't match up against historic trends, or there's statistical anomalies in the data of what's being processed, the humans become focused on those exceptions. So that's just one sort of micro process or example of where machine learning and AI is starting to get built into technology better than it was in the past. Now, the thing here, though, is it's still, again, two things to think about. One is it's not fully permeated into enterprise technology in general. There's certainly plenty of money being spent on machine learning development capabilities and artificial intelligence, but it's still, as I mentioned, not quite fully integrated into enterprise technologies, the more common enterprise technologies. So that's one thing. It's still very much a work in progress. The other thing to think about too is the impact that machine learning and AI has on an organization is very dramatic, or it can be very dramatic if you fully take advantage of it. So when you think about things like the example I gave, where we're going to automate our invoice processing and our AP processes, and we're going to have humans focus on exceptions rather than having humans manually process every single invoice. That's a huge change for most organizations. And it's a lot easier said than done to say that we're going to save X percent of time or X dollars per year on processing invoices. The potential's there, but actually getting there is a lot more painful than organizations realize or plan for. And so they stick a number in their business case. Hopefully they've done a business case and they stick a number in it. But then actually getting there and realizing those benefits is a whole nother story. So it's really important to make sure that you have a realistic view of how we're going to get there. What's our transition plan? And again, back to change management. This stuff, machine learning and AI, isn't going to matter if we don't have really strong change management to go along with it. And I'd say that the sexier and the more sophisticated that technology becomes and the faster technology changes, the more important organizational change management is. We've got to, so it's almost like adding a anecdote to the technological change that can be threatening and disruptive to organizations. We need to add even more change management on the human side to make sure that we bring the two together to integrate the two. So machine learning, AI, really exciting trend. I think it's super cool what's happening here, but it's also, again, very disruptive. Most people say disruption in a good way, like it's disruption and it's going to be a game changer. But we also have to look at it in the short term. What is that going to do to our organization? How do we manage that? How do we navigate it? What do we do with those people that, their jobs are being automated, or suddenly they don't have as much work to do? Are we getting rid of people? Are we reassigning them? Are we reskilling them or upskilling them to do something different? All that stuff we have to think carefully through to get the full benefit of these and other types of technologies. Another hot commodity or thing that's becoming more and more important, but it's not necessarily a technology per se, is risk mitigation. Along with the rapid pace of change and the disruption and the impact to organizations comes an elevated level of risk. And again, this is another point that software vendors oftentimes don't want to mention, or they may not want to call out because it could be considered a weakness. But the reality is that these sorts of transformations are becoming riskier. The opportunities are greater, the benefits are greater than they've ever been, but the path to get there and that gap between current state and future state is much larger than it's ever been. And so organizations need to be real careful about how they manage risk. And again, it's a matter of making sure you've got a clear and realistic roadmap and expectations for how we're going to achieve the business benefits that we're expecting to see, and also how are we going to identify and mitigate risks along the way. I'll give you an example of one common example is that when organizations decide they're going to start an ERP implementation, of enterprise-wide technology initiative, a lot of times they go through this strenuous evaluation process. They decide on the technology. Momentum's really high. People are excited, and they're ready to just jump in and start doing stuff. They sign the contract. They have access to the software. System integrator and vendor are pressuring them to get started right away because it's in their best interest for you to start right away, so they can start billing for the subscription costs as well as billing you for the system integrator time. But the reality is that's a real dangerous path to go down. You end up what we could oftentimes I'll often refer to as cliff diving. We're just jumping into the abyss without a clear vision of what we want to be when we grow up or how we're going to manage this project. System integrator comes in and steamrolls us, and we end up spending way too much time and money on an initiative that we didn't need to spend that much time and money. So that's just a real simple, common example of how risk mitigation and proper planning can help reduce your costs, reduce your risk. But then again, getting back to that point of that massive jump that we're making in a lot of our transformations with these new technologies and that sort of thing, risk is higher than ever. So how do we mitigate the risk and identify those along the way? That's a key thing that's going to be a big differentiator between successful organizations and organizations that fail in their initiatives going forward. And then similarly, flexibility is going to become a competitive advantage. That tends to be an area that organizations struggle with now with their old legacy systems. And a lot of clients that call us say, hey, we need help getting off our old system because we just aren't flexible enough. We can't adapt fast enough with the system we have in place that we've had for 20 or 30 years. So let's find some technology that's going to help us be more flexible. And again, if our goal is to be flexible, and flexibility is an important part of your organizational strategy and in your future and your path forward, then you want to make sure that you are building a strategy and roadmap and plan that is focused on that. So, for example, if you're evaluating potential ERP systems out there, and you go with a large standard ERP system like an SAP S/4HANA, for example, relatively speaking, that's a relatively inflexible system when you compare it to other systems like Oracle or maybe Microsoft Dynamics. It's just not as flexible. It provides you more common business processes potentially, and potentially more scale and efficiency, but it doesn't provide you flexibility as much as potentially other solutions out there. So that's the sort of thing, not just in your software evaluation, that you need to be thinking about it, just in terms of our overall roadmap, or how do we embed maximum flexibility within our organization if that's important to us, and how do we ensure that we have the right technologies, the right strategies, the right roadmap, the right change management approach, all that good stuff to make sure that we're being effective in achieving that and accomplishing that goal. Now, the other part of this that I think is very important to mention, and again, it's not related to technology, but it is an important trend, is that the human side of change isn't going to change. And what I mean by that is change management is still important. We as humans don't like to change, despite, no matter how open-minded we think we are. The reality is we don't like to change, and we certainly don't like to change as fast as technology is changing. And the pace of change with technology is only accelerating. So this is becoming more of a phenomena over time. And so the fact that the human side of change won't change is good news, bad news. The bad news is that it's still going to be very important, and the technology is going to make it more important and more risky from a human perspective. But the good news is that the things you should be doing from a change management perspective hasn't really changed a lot. I mean, if you're doing it right, the change management stuff you were doing 5 or 10 years ago, if it was done effectively, it's still going to apply now and in the future. So that's the good news, is that the change management piece of it is constantly an important factor. Now, the other problem here is that most organizations never handled change management well in the first place. And so the fact that now technology is changing faster and change management is becoming even more important to organizations going forward is a pretty significant risk. So for those of you that are in the change management space and are good at change management, there's a lot of opportunity in the market. And this is going to be a very in-demand need, I would suspect, in the coming years, as organizations start to feel the pain of technological change and the level of disruption that it brings to their organizations. So the human side of change isn't really changing, despite all the other changes in the industry and with technology. So the key question to ask yourself as we think about our long-term roadmap to 2025 and beyond is, how are we going to address that human side of change? How are we going to navigate it? How are we going to treat organizational change and the human side of the component equal or greater than technology? Too often organizations spend way too much time and money on the technological piece. And again, you have to think about dynamics here and the human behavior. There's two things at play in terms of why we spend so much time and money on technology and so little time and money on the human side. One is that it's a lot easier to see and touch and feel when the technology doesn't work. So we end up gravitating to the thing that we can see and touch and feel. We can see it when it's broken. We know it's broken. We can test it, and either it works or it doesn't. When it comes to the human side of organizational change management, it's not as cut and dry. It's harder to see and touch and feel. It's more of an art than a science. And that makes it more difficult for people within an organization to see the importance of it and to understand what's happening and what needs to be done to navigate the change. And then the other dynamic that I think creating is this unevenly distributed focus on too much technology and not enough human side of change is the fact that you have software vendors and system integrators in the marketplace that are very focused on technology, and they're pushing very hard on the technology work stream or the technology piece of transformation. So that ends up being where so many people's time and attention ends up going for that reason as well. So really making sure we have a clear vision for organizational change management strategy is going to be critical. And that's going to be definitely a critical success factor for organizations going forward. So that takes us to the end of my presentation here. And again, the intent here is to provide a quick flyover view of what are some of those challenges and things that we should be aware of, and certain trends that we see happening in the marketplace at a high level. Again, we're going to dive into a lot of the stuff that I just glossed over here now. We're going to dive into in sessions throughout the day and throughout the week as well. The one that's probably most relevant to this discussion, or a most relevant follow-on or part two, will be Stuart's session here in a little over an hour. So that being said, I guess I'll open it to any questions that the audience might have, and then we'll take a quick break and then come back with our next speaker. But what questions do you have, or Kyler, have any questions come through that I didn't see? I wasn't fully paying attention the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. So Enrique, who's joining us from Chile, has a question about working with global teams and how that might impact your overall project. So he had given some specific examples, obviously South Africa, US. How do you kind of make sure that you're implementing the best practices when you're working on global transformations? I know you know a lot about that, and so do other professionals at Third Stage. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'll say that I believe it's tomorrow. Adam Cheatham is doing a session on global transformations. And correct me if I'm wrong. Is it tomorrow, Kyler, that he has that session?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So he's going to dive more into that. He'll spend a full session just on global transformations. But the thing I'll add, maybe just as a sort of a preview or a high level introduction, would be, I mean, first of all, you want to have, if I have to sort of check off the things that come to mind that are most important for a global transformation, one would be to have a cross geographical core team, people from all different parts in different countries that not only understand the culture locally and how, the culture is different from other parts of the organization, but also how the operations are different. And also just understanding how some of the nuances and differences between their part of the organization. And then also you want people that are not only cross geographical, that understand the current state, amongst all the different areas of the world, but also people that have a vision or can help formulate a vision for what it could be going forward. So that's the first thing, is having that core team. Second thing would be to really take a close look at and have a clear vision and strategy for what is it you want the organization to be globally. Are you trying to migrate? And I'll give you two extreme examples. It's usually not either one of these. It's usually somewhere on a continuum in between. But are you looking for this project to drive a sort of standardization and a common operating model across the entire organization? Are you looking for independently operated parts of the world where each region or each office acts as their own entity in essence? Or is there some hybrid in between? And usually it's a hybrid in between, and usually it's different based on what business process you're talking about or what function or capability within the organization you're talking about. For example, you might decide that we're going to centralize and consolidate and standardize finance, but our sales and customer service, we're going to keep that fairly flexible. We're going to keep that decentralized. We're going to let the regions or the different country offices handle their own sales and customer services processes. So those are the types of decisions that, again, you want to make those decisions early in the project before you ever start bringing in system integrators, before you ever even pick your software solution. Those are the types of answers that you want to define. And you want to make sure that you carefully weigh the pros and the cons of that. And then the other thing I would say, I guess if I had to think of a third thing that is worth noting with global transformations, is just making sure you have a clear rollout transition strategy. And usually for global organizations, it's typically a multi-year process if you're a mid-sized, a larger organization. And you just want to have a clear roadmap for how that transition is going to happen and where what the sequence of rollouts are going to be and what the risks and the trade-offs are of that. So those are some of the things that come to mind. And again, Adam's session will dive more into that in in particular.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And then we have just a few more. So we'll do, how about 2 more and then take a quick break before we go into Marcus. So Dave asked, what will the #1 challenge be for organizations in 2025? It's a big one.
Wow, that's a great question. And I just froze up. Did you notice that? It wasn't me freezing up trying to think. It was totally a tech issue there.
Sure.
No, but the biggest thing to be aware of, I guess it would just be, if I had to predict, I'd say I think there's going to be in about 4 years from now, if we're talking 2025, I think that's probably about the time where you start to see the tension build between technology and human side of the equation. I think technology is changing so much in a way that, again, is very opportunistic and has a lot of upside potential for organizations and businesses, but it's super disruptive to people, as I mentioned. And I think that I call it a divergence, even though it's not intended to be that, but it's sort of a strain that's building between, the threat of eliminating jobs and the threat of completely disrupting people's skills and what they were trained to do. I think that's going to reach a tipping point or a boiling point. And that, again, comes back to change management, where I think change management is going to become even more important by 2025 just because of that. So I think that tension building and bubbling under the surface, again, if you just think about machine learning and artificial intelligence, that's probably the best example. Or robotics. I know manufacturers have dealt with robotics now for a long time, so it's nothing new to a lot of manufacturers. But you think about robotic process automation and some of the other uses of robotic type technology, and again, the end result, whether you like it or not, or whether it's the intent or not, is that you're displacing humans. And so, with that acceleration of technology and trends in that direction, along with the humans' inability to change as fast as technology, I think you're gonna see more of a tipping point there with change management.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know we have a lot of Q&A regarding OCM, so I just want to remind everyone that our director, Nate, will actually go through that later today. So be sure to check out that session. I also just want to remind everyone that we are garnering all of your questions for the music Q&A tonight. So just in case we don't get to you, we definitely see them there. The last one I think we'll go through today, Eric. Maritza had a question regarding digital transformation for a construction company. And I think it's a good one because she covers field service versus head office. So making sure that those systems work together. And she's wondering if that's possible. So can you just kind of touch on, if you are in the field service or have a distribution leg of your business, what that looks like in the ERP lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's 2 paths you can take there, and we work a lot with a lot of utility and construction type companies, so energy utilities, construction, a lot of organizations like that have that need for field services. And there's 2 different paths you can take. You have your sort of traditional ERP route, where you start with your back office functions like finance, accounting, inventory management, and then you figure out how could we extend that to the field service. And not every ERP system out there handles field services well, and some just don't handle it at all. There are some systems like, for example, IFS is a mid-market ERP system that has strong field service capabilities. So there are ERP systems like that and others like IFS and others out there where yes, it has the core back office ERP systems, but it's also or the core back office ERP functions, but it also has strong field service capabilities. Now, with ERP systems in general, you always have that decision or trade-off you have to make. Is it more important for us to have one system that isn't going to meet everyone's needs by definition? Or do we want more of a best-of-breed approach where we can find the best back office system and then go out and find the best field service solution that could then integrate with the back office system? And there are field services options out there, systems that are more focused on field services from a best-of-breed perspective. That you could then integrate back to your ERP system. And so I think that you could go either way, but I think it's a lot of times comes down to, what are the priorities of the organization? If you're, field services is a critical part of what this transformation is going to mean to you and your organization, maybe that becomes your top priority, is to evaluate options from a field service first perspective, and then maybe you can accept whatever you can get with accounting and finance, for example. But other organizations are, have a CFO driving a transformation, and they might do the opposite and say finance is the most important thing. Whatever we can get out of field services is fine. So I think that's part of the question you have to ask, not just for field services versus back office, but for any function. I mean, if you're in sales, or if you're in a warehouse and you're thinking about warehouse management, those are all examples of the types of trade-offs you may need to think about and really prioritize accordingly. So we see a lot of organizations that'll, have like a field service group, or we see this a lot with sales organizations where they just sort of go off on their own and just find the technology that's going to meet their needs best. And then they work with IT to figure out how to tie it back together. But if it's part of a broader transformation where you're looking at all your systems across the entire enterprise, that's where you want to weigh the pros and cons of both paths there.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks so much, Eric. Great presentation. And just for anyone that is looking for more of a software selection information piece, our Chief Client Officer and Managing Partner, Brian Potts, will be going into that on Thursday. So just a reminder, if you click that register for tomorrow's session down there, you can view all of our workshops for this week. So with that, we are going to take a quick 6-minute break. We'll meet back here at 12:05 Eastern Time US. I'm just going to put up the agenda for the rest of the day. Next up is Marcus Harris, who is an attorney from our great sponsors at Taft Law. So he'll be going into some digital transformation failures. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break, 6-minute break, and meet back here at 12:05. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Skylar.
Okay, everybody. So welcome back. Our next speaker we are going to invite up is Marcus Harris. So again, an attorney at Taft Law, and Marcus actually specializes in enterprise software licensing, and he's also a litigation attorney. Obviously, he's going to talk to us today about ERP failures. He's been in the business a long time and has definitely seen a lot. So this is a really important discussion to garner those best practices when you are going into contract negotiation or implementing with a vendor or system integrator. So welcome to the floor, Marcus. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Marcus. Well, thanks so much for taking us through this, and I will hand it on over to you.
All right. So are you, just a point of clarification, are you going to share the PowerPoint or do you want me to share the PowerPoint?
You can go ahead and share it. That way we can walk through it with you at your cadence if that works for you.
Yeah, apologies, let me try to figure this out here.
No worries. So at the top of the screen, if you hover across your face, there's a little share screen button there, and you can share your PowerPoint. And while Marcus is just getting started here, if you do have specific questions for him, go ahead and start to put those in the Ask a Question section or in the comments so that we can make sure that we're pulling those for the end of the session or throughout our conversation here.
Well, I have to apologize. When I hit share, it asked me to share to Facebook, so.
It's actually at the top of your screen. There's three little areas there. There's a microphone, there's a camera, there's an HD. It's right over your face in Crowdcast. And let me go ahead and just pull up your slides too, just in case we need some help there. No problem. All right. Do you want me to go ahead and share then, Marcus?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, unfortunately, I don't really see.
No worries. No problem. I got you here. Just let me know if you want me to slow down or whatever you need to switch slides, and we'll start our conversation here, okay?
All right, thank you.
Yep, can you see my screen okay?
I can, perfect.
Excellent.
All right, so let me just introduce myself briefly. I am a technology attorney, even though that was probably a relatively poor evidence of my skill set. But for approximately, I'd say 20 plus years, I have been involved almost exclusively in the ERP space, both as an in-house attorney and representing both small to mid-sized software companies, and also representing licensees or customers of software vendors, as well as integrators of software systems. So I think what I can bring to the table, and I really do hope this is interactive and that you're asking a lot of questions, because I can give you the perspective of both from the inside and also from what I think is reasonable. And in every negotiation that you get into and every litigation, there's what both sides want and where they're going to meet in the middle. So some of the objectives for this session today are going to be to really provide you with an understanding of the common reasons why ERP implementations will typically fail. And I think you can generally say that, and you're right, that every ERP implementation is different. Okay, it's going to be different in scope, it's going to be different in size, it will definitely be different in industry, and certainly the type of functionality or solution that's being implemented is going to vary widely. But they almost all fail for similar reasons. So while they're all different, the challenges and the issues that you're going to encounter are almost always going to be, if not identical, then certainly very similar. I think it's incumbent upon me today to share with you so that you have an understanding of how to minimize the likelihood that your ERP implementation or integration is going to fail. And I think there are certain steps that are tried and true that if you take on the front end that are really going to pay off in spades on the back end. And then, God forbid, to the extent that you are in a situation that you can't get out of and litigation seems like it is an option for you, I want you to walk away from this understanding what you're up against, what the likely costs are going to be, what some of the likely outcomes would be, what the likely arguments that you're going to make, and what the vendor is going to make, so that you're well prepared, for really kind of the 10,000 foot level of getting involved in the ERP implementation. You are going to have an understanding of what to look out for, how to minimize the likelihood that these issues are going to arise, and if they do, you're going to be at least somewhat knowledgeable of what that litigation landscape is going to look like. So I think, without a doubt, every ERP implementation that you get involved in is going to take longer than you expected. The front end estimations as to how long the implementation are going to take are really best case scenarios that are told to you by, in my view, overly aggressive salespeople that are concerned only with you signing the contract and them getting a commission. So they're going to downplay how difficult it might be, how long it's going to take. Certainly, I think it's going to cost more than you anticipate, and it's going to cost in some ways or sometimes significantly more than what has been estimated to you. I think if you get an estimate from a vendor as to how long and how much it's going to cost, I think from a cost perspective, you need to think at least 30% more, at least. And then I think you have to have certainly reasonable expectations, and you've got to tamp them down sometimes significantly. Surveys that I have read, surveys that I know Third Stage has conducted, indicate that really, the majority of businesses out there simply don't realize the majority of the business benefits that they expected to receive from the software implementation or the software once it was implemented. So, for a system that sometimes is costing many hundreds of thousands to many millions of dollars for, you not to receive the majority of the business benefits that you thought that you were going to get is certainly, problematic. And I think there's ways to minimize the likelihood of that happening to you. Okay, so, how do these challenges play out in real life? Okay. I want to go through a couple of examples. I think, by necessity, we've got to kind of treat these, from a 10,000 foot level for a variety of reasons. One, LK Plastics is a real case that I am litigating now. I can't, in good conscience, share anything that would be privileged or confidential, but I can give you insights as they are disclosed in documents that would be publicly available on the court's websites, or documents that you could, go to the courthouse and pull. BBSI is another failed Oracle implementation that I can give you some insight into. I am not involved in that one, but I've got a general understanding from some of the attorneys that are involved in that case of how it's going and what to look out for and what you could expect if you're going to litigate against Oracle / NetSuite. Janco, I want to talk about that briefly. That really is kind of an oddity, and that's a situation that has arisen for Janco out of a failed implementation, but really out of the way that they financed that deal, and it's also happened to LK Plastics. So we'll talk about that in a second. So let's go into LK. LK is a company that you may or may not have heard about. It is a global supplier of packaging, primarily for the food service and healthcare industries, though they do provide what they would call flexible packaging for industry in general. So these are the kinds of packaging that, your Lunchables will come in, or, some kind of interesting yogurt packaging. This is the kind of product that they make. They've got multiple distribution centers throughout the country, and we're in the process when they reached out to Oracle of wanting to replace their 15-year-old legacy system. It was a system from Texas, TECSYS, which is, I'd say, a third-tier software provider based in Canada that we've dealt with extensively in the past, both from a litigation standpoint and from a contract negotiation standpoint. So Elkay in 2017 issues an RFP detailing specifically what their requirements for the new system were. And essentially, I think you can boil it down and say that in a nutshell, it's safe to say that, Elkay was looking to, upgrade their technology system, their computer systems, with a system that would be better than the system that they had previously installed, right? I mean, you don't go into this wanting to take a technological step backward, or, as Elkay would allege, multiple steps back. So when Oracle started implementing the NetSuite system, it became readily apparent that the processing times within the system for all transactions were generally between 4 seconds on the top end to 30 seconds, as maybe an outlier, but certainly performance times within the system to do any transaction, whether it was taking orders or whatnot, was, between 4 and 30 seconds, with an average, say, of 15 seconds per transaction, which, for I think any modern commercial enterprise, that's simply just unworkable for at least modern commercial needs. And just to give you an idea of how bad that was, by way of comparison, Elkay's legacy system was able to process transactions in the system in approximately 2 seconds. So they were going from 2 seconds to 4, and in some cases to 30. Now, Elkay wasn't silent about this. To get the processing speeds down, Oracle said, essentially, give me more money, give me more patience, and give me more time, and we can get this to work for you in the way that it was represented during the sales cycle. And I preface this with these are all allegations, right? But essentially, what Elkay would allege is that Oracle urged them to implement additional functionality and to customize the system extensively by way of 20 individual customizations to get the software to work, as Elkay would say, as represented during the sales process, to the tune of about, I'd say $3 million. Elkay listens to Oracle, implements these customizations and modifications. It doesn't have any kind of substantial impact on the speed of the system, and Elkay asserts that the software is essentially unusable. That's the biggest issue with Elkay. There's certain other issues with the way that pallets were organized, the way that shipping labels were processed. So, all of that kind of falls under one bucket of ending up with a system that is really just unworkable for modern commercial needs. Barrett Business Services, Inc., BBSI, is a well-known provider of business management solutions for primarily small to mid-sized companies. BBSI enters into an Oracle license agreement, and once it does, for whatever reason, Oracle's salespeople begin aggressively pushing Oracle's HCM cloud functionality. And the allegations in this case are that Oracle severely, substantially misrepresented the capabilities of that HCM functionality, and then at the same time downplayed its limitations. BBSI alleges in its court filings that only after it signed a $15 million licensing deal and then a $500,000 statement of work did it discover that the HCM system was essentially riddled with design, functionality, interface, and integration gaps. So massive gaps in functionality. And it wasn't as they say, Oracle represented an out-of-the-box piece of software with out-of-the-box functionality that could be used. And to get over the functionality gaps, Oracle had proposed a 2-year process at a cost of $33 million for customizations, which the original estimation for customizations to the system was about $6 million. So, again, not a situation that you want to end up in. Janco, again, it's an Oracle deal. And just as an aside, I'm highlighting Oracle and NetSuite deals because we've been personally involved with them recently. And I think, the NetSuite solution is perceived to be, in my view, as something that's easier to implement, that isn't as complex as, say, an SAP system. And I think certainly Oracle pitches it that way, but I think you've got to be aware. I don't think that, Oracle in and of itself is more likely to have issues or failures than any other system. I think it's just, it's easier to kind of to highlight and pick on. One reason for that is that they've got way more customers, and if you've got a high number of customers, the likelihood that any one of them is going to sue you becomes higher. So these are just easier for us to find to some extent. Janco, it's a similar situation. They implement the software. They say that it has substantial gaps in functionality, and it's just unusable and doesn't work for them. The twist with the Janco situation, and it's not unlike the LK situation, is that Oracle pitches these things as kind of a low-cost alternative to more complicated systems. And one of the ways they do that is they say, look, you can finance your purchase. And of course, what you do is you enter into an agreement with Oracle's financing company. Sometimes those contracts are then sold out to another financing company, but regardless of how it plays out, you are ultimately on the hook, and they decouple the performance of the software from the obligation to pay. So it doesn't matter that you have nothing to show for the investment that you've made. The financing company is going to sue you. And so, if you're contemplating financing the deal, I would suggest that you do not do that. Because I think you're just inviting trouble, and you really take away a lot of the leverage that you've got, and you give Oracle and its financing arm a sledgehammer to beat you over the head with if there ever is litigation. So, what are the takeaways from these case studies, these pieces of litigation? And I think one is, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second, there is enough blame to go around. In any one of these cases, there always is enough blame to go around. I don't think that you can squarely point the finger in all situations at the software vendor or the integrator, and I don't think you can squarely point the finger at the customer either. But I think the common themes that we see, certainly on the vendor side, and these are the allegations that I will guarantee Oracle is making in these other cases and is making in the case that I've got, they will say that the customer expected the new software system to operate in the same exact way as the 15-year-old legacy system. They were unwilling to change. The customizations were primarily for the purposes of getting the software to work just the same way as the old system. Now, I think there's some legitimacy to that, just generally, not necessarily in this cases, but in certain cases. But the lesson is you've got to be willing to change, right? You can't customize the system with $33 million in customizations and expect it to work flawlessly and expect it to be easy to maintain. And that says nothing to that you've just blown your budget, you're outside of scope. There's no way that any kind of estimations as to cost or timelines are going to be met when you're doing that amount of customizations. And as we say here, software customizations will absolutely kill a project. In the LK case, they essentially did everything right. They had hired, and this is in the documents, they had hired a third-party software selection company to identify what their business processes were, to identify a software vendor that would provide a system that had the least amount of gaps, and they still had issues, right? So, choosing the right integrator and the right vendor is certainly incredibly important, but I think, it's not the only answer. I think the answer is, managing the project, having reasonable expectations, and going in with your eyes wide open so that what failure looks like, and how to minimize the likelihood that it can happen. I think one of the keys that we see consistently in these cases and other cases is that executive misalignment can absolutely kill a project. I mean, if your executives don't understand the business processes or understand them with the specificity that you think they need to, or there's competing interest as to what system is going to be the right system, and then somebody wants SAP, somebody wants Oracle, and the people that are in charge don't get their way. I think the likelihood that them being misaligned with a project is going to have an adverse impact is relatively high. And the last thing is, what you see in each one of these cases is the customer alleging that the software doesn't work. Okay. And I think, they've got a legitimate basis for that, but you also have to understand, I mean, is it the software that's not working, or is it really just failing to work for your business, right? And, the vendor is going to argue, well, we've implemented this software successfully in hundreds of thousands of companies around the world, and there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that you've done it that leads you to argue that it can't work for you. So, I think, point of fact, these things don't fail because of a technology issue necessarily, right? It's not a failure of technology. It's a failure of people. It's a failure to manage the process correctly. And that's what we see over and over. So that's kind of the broad scope. So let's get into, what are the substantive lessons that you can take away from these examples of failure? And let's go to the next slide. So, the first thing is, and we'll get into these in more detail, you've really got to define clear project goals. If you don't know why you're implementing an ERP system, you really have a problem. If you're implementing it simply because everyone else in your industry is implementing that project, or that software product rather, then I think you're setting yourself up for failure. I think you've got to understand what types of functionality you need, how they're going to address your business requirements. You've got to understand, how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take. If you don't have an understanding of those things, you're really doing yourself a disservice. You have to have an intimate understanding of what your business requirements are, because only if you have an understanding of what the requirements are, and you've gone through the painful process of understanding them, of workflowing them, of getting your handle on what the business requirements are, that's the only way you're going to understand if there's a gap in functionality or not. And then once you understand whether there is a gap or not, you're going to be able to make a reasoned decision as to whether you can live with that gap. It's something that's got to be addressed programmatically through customizations, or there's some other methodology which you can deal with. Choosing the right software, I said, it's not as important sometimes, but it's certainly, if you don't choose the right software, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? I think, if you've got, say you haven't chosen the software that's 100% for you, I don't think that automatically means that you're going to fail, but I think it certainly makes it more difficult. And you've got to have realistic expectations. Is 4 seconds unreasonable for modern commercial needs? I don't know. It depends on what that transaction is and how important it is. 30 seconds, I think, certainly is, unreasonable, but you've got to have realistic expectations for what the software can do. The business advantages it is going to provide to you. You've got to have realistic expectations with respect to how long the implementation is going to take. You have to have reasonable expectations about, how much it's going to cost. And we talked about developing process workflows. That's something that you've got to go through the pain of doing. I've had a client in the past that didn't want to do that and left it up to the software company. And as you can imagine, that didn't work out very well. And then, finally, you have to be, super diligent and almost have a micromanagement kind of style to some extent. with some exceptions, in the management of the scope and the management of the costs of the project, because you've got the interest of the vendor, whether it's the integrator or the software vendor who's doing the integration, their interest is divergent from your interest, right? They are happy to have you on the roll for as long as it's going to take. They generate revenue from more customizations, more modifications, more billable hours, and they're not particularly interested in taking a reasoned and measured approach to this. And if you're not stepping in to tightly rein them in, then they're going to go off the rails, so to speak. So next slide. Okay, so we talked about project goals, and I think you've got to make an effort to establish what the goals are as early as possible on the front end. And I think if you don't understand, like I said, why you're implementing your ERP system, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Again, if it's simply because you want the latest and greatest, that's not a reason to implement something, right? If it's because everybody else in your industry is doing it, again, you're setting yourself up for failure. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to have identified and quantify opportunities for improvement with respect to your business flow, your business processes, and then identify the software system that matches most closely to where you want to get and how you do business, not only today, but how you want to do business in the future. Because only by understanding what your goal is, and again, it's not a technology goal. It can't be a technology goal necessarily. It's got to be a business goal. These are business processes. These are business systems. And the goal of the system, just generally speaking, is to run your business more efficiently, right? And if you don't have an understanding of how the system is going to do that, then I think the likelihood that you're going to end up in litigation is increased. Let's go to the next slide. And this goes hand in hand. You've got, like I said, to put the work in to understand what the business requirements are. You can't do that, by the seat of your pants. You can't do that with any really, degree of success while the implementation is happening. I think you've got to do it on the front end. You've got to have an understanding of what your requirements are prior to engaging in the evaluation and selection process. I mean, if you're going into a software demo and you're asked to rate how good a system is, and you don't understand what the requirement is that you're assessing the software against, how are you making a reasoned decision, right? And I think the key to this, and to some extent I said it already, is really to focus on how you're doing business today, how you can improve on the business processes that you're utilizing so that you can be where you want to be tomorrow, right? I think one of the key issues that you've got to think about too, from a business requirement standing perspective, is what are your deal breakers, right? Because no software system is going to match 100% with your business requirements. This is not possible. Every software can be customized. Every software is going to have a gap, and it's not going to be a one-to-one 100% fit. So you've got to understand what your deal breakers are, and you've got to lead with those as you go into these evaluations and when you're selecting the software that you think you want to integrate. From the LK case, their deal breaker apparently was how fast the system is going to run, right? And one of the key questions in the litigation is going to be, well, did you tell anybody, right? And what did you tell them about that? And I think a fair question, and this is not necessarily for the LK case, but with any software implementation, is when there's a key failure, right? When the software doesn't do something that you deem to be key to your business, how do you even get into that situation? And I think it's because you didn't go through the business requirements process, and you certainly didn't prioritize your deal breakers. Because if you had, you would have said, here are the 3 things that we need from this software system. It has to do this, it has to do this, and it has to do this. And if you do that, then I think the likelihood that you're going to end up in a lawsuit on the back end saying, well, the software didn't function in the way that we expected it to, or it didn't perform this key functionality or piece of functionality that was the most important thing for a business. Okay. So how do you get there? How do you prioritize deal breakers? I think you've got to engage your key employees and key decision makers. You've got to go a couple rungs down to make sure that these individuals that actually are in the trenches every day, that you're talking to them and that you take into account how they do business and what they see with respect to the software, or their utilization of the software, and what they deem to be important with the software. So next slide. And again, the lesson learned here is choose the right software, right? And again, choosing the right software isn't a panacea. It's not going to necessarily guarantee that your project is successful and that you won't end up in litigation, but I think it's going to go a long way. Even with the right software, the software that has the least amount of gaps, I think you can still go off the rails. Certainly, if you implement the wrong software, you've got a problem, right? If the software clearly doesn't meet the majority of your business requirements, I think you're guaranteeing that you're going to fail. One of the key takeaways, when you're evaluating the software and you're involved in the sales cycle, is that you absolutely need to be critical of what the software vendor is telling you. I think that makes that's common sense. I think it just makes sense. But people get so caught up in the bells and whistles and the sizzle that they forget to look behind the curtain and see if there's anything substantial there, right? You don't buy the sizzle, you buy the steak. And the steak isn't necessarily sexy, right? It's all the fancy screens and the beautiful way the software looks and the modifications that you can do to it. That's what sells software to some extent, but that's not what's going to make you successful. I think that you've got to understand that, time and time again, we get complaints in my office about overly aggressive software salespeople that minimize the gaps in functionality. They minimize the difficulty associated with the software system, but maximize the perceived value of that system and the business benefits that you're going to realize. And I think you have to take it with a grain of salt, because if you don't, you're going to buy right into what they're selling you, and it just doesn't make any sense. And there's reasons why people do that. There's all sorts of politics associated with these kinds of selections and business environments that are toxic, so to speak. And people are invested in certain systems, and it's what they've used. But you've got to cut through it. You've got to see it for what it is. You've got to ask the right questions. And part of this process, I think, in my experience, certainly on both sides of these deals, is you've got to do site visits. You've got to go see how other companies in your industry are actually using the software. And I think it's incumbent upon you as well to have the freedom and to demand that you've got the freedom to ask the right questions, to talk to the people that are using the software, because what happens time and time again is that the vendor's not going to set you up for a visit with somebody that's not happy with the software, right? So you're getting a biased view of how that software works, and it might only be kind of tangentially in your industry, which doesn't provide a lot of value. And one of the other great secrets of the software vendor play is that they absolutely give these people incentives to say nice things to you, right? They give them free customizations, free modifications, free maintenance, free support, additional years on their subscription, whatever it is. So you've got to look at this all with a jaundiced eye to be able to evaluate the software in the right way. Next slide. I think it goes without saying, and in some ways, these lessons kind of fall back on each other to some extent, right? You've got to have realistic expectations. And I think, how do you know, right? Part of it is asking the right questions in site visits and demonstrations, not being swayed by the sizzle, looking for the steak, grounding yourself in reality. But to the extent that you can, I think you really want to benchmark, your implementation against other similar implementations. That's going to be incredibly valuable to you as a tool to really, have an understanding of what the lay of the land is and what you're getting yourself involved in. And how do you do that? Well, I think you look at market studies, you look at people that are in your industry that are similar sizes, that have implemented a similar system, how long it has taken and how much they spent. Were they under budget? Were they over budget? That's critical to your success, to really have an understanding of what you're getting into. And to be honest with you, there's no shortage of consultancies that do these kinds of analyses, and are more than happy to talk to you. So I think you've got to know what's out there. You've got to utilize resources that you've got. And I think spending a little bit of money on these kinds of things on the front end is really going to serve you well and minimize the likelihood that you're going to spend a ton more money on the back end. I think to some extent, if you only focus on technical issues, again, you're kind of missing the point. Okay, technical issues are going to be important for understanding what you're getting into, right? And understanding whether the software is a good fit or not. And that, like we said, that's important, but it's not dispositive. I think in addition to focusing on technical issues, you've got to focus on the non-technical issues. You've got to focus on organizational change management. It's incredibly important. Getting over the hump of the resistance to implementing a new system is critical. It's probably one of the most critical things that you can do. I think you've got to invest in user training. You've got to make sure that everybody is on board with the system, how it operates, and that they've got some level of excitement about transitioning to a new system. And then you've got to deal with this concept of user acceptance. And I think that can go in a couple of ways. One, users just generally have to be able to accept the process, right? Accept the fact that they're getting a new software system. But I think this goes back to involving key decision makers. You want to have a user acceptance process, whereby key users are actually making a determination as to whether the software's fit and functionality actually makes sense, and to the extent it doesn't, that there's a way to tweak the software to get it to work in the way that is expected or in the way that was represented. And there's a fine line here too, right? You're not trying to replicate the legacy system necessarily, but the business requirements need to be met. And the only way to do that is with user acceptance and user analysis and user input. Next slide. Well, and here you go, right? Involve key users in the process. I think, again, sticking with the theme of focusing on not just technical issues, but non-technical issues, you've got to view the ERP project as a business initiative and not a technology project. You can't necessarily let your IT department just run with the whole thing. There's got to be a holistic approach to the whole thing, and you've got to make sure that you involve your users for the duration of the implementation project, from the very beginning to the very end. Next slide. Don't make the mistake that I've seen with my clients, where they think, okay, well, the software vendor told me that this software system is designed specifically for my industry. It contains industry best practices that I need to adapt my workflows and my business processes to. Even software that's sold as off the shelf is going to need some modification or some customization. There will be a functionality gap. You've got to understand and define what your business processes are, your business requirements. You've got to spend a substantive amount of time defining what your workflows are, because if you don't, I don't think you're going to understand, where the functionality gaps are, how your business needs to change to accommodate the software, or how the software can change to accommodate your business processes and your workflows. I had a situation with a client about 3 or 4 years ago, and I might have mentioned it already, where they just washed their hands of this whole process. Okay, they said, you know what, we understand how our business works. You will explain it to you, but we're not going to spend substantive time, going through flow charts and diagrams so that you have an understanding as the vendor or the integrator into our business. We'll explain it to you generally, but the software is supposed to have best practices integrated into it already. So this is an unnecessary process. Not surprisingly, that system, that integration failed. Okay, so you can't short shift this process, and I don't think you can emphasize it enough. Next slide. How do you manage the scope and the cost of the project, right? I think on the front end, what you've got to do is you've got to negotiate contracts that really serve as a management tool for this kind of process. You've got to have change orders. You've got to have flexibility within that contract to be able to approve and to reject vendor consultants. You want to be able to have the ability to look at their resumes. You want to have key person clauses to the extent it makes sense, because I think what happens on the vendor side is they're going to direct their consultants to the projects that are the most profitable or the project that they're going to make the most money off of, right? So if you're sitting here with a measly $2 million implementation project, and they've got GM with a $50 million implementation project, you can bet that the $50 million project is going to get the lion's share of the consultants, and that you're going to get kind of the B team, the C team, or even the D team. So and this is not uncommon, by the way. I mean, we see this happen on a pretty regular basis, where one of the allegations is that the vendor used the client's implementation project as a training ground for incompetent and inexperienced consultants. So you've got to ensure that the project teams, not only on the vendor side, but on your side, have the requisite experience. And I think you've got to put in the contract language that allows you to verify what the experience level is and to protect yourself. I think these implementation projects live and die by the statement of work. Okay, the statement of work, to me, is probably the most important document that you're going to sign. Sure, the software license or the SaaS agreement is important, but again, the software probably works, right? The consulting agreement or the master services agreement is an important document, but that's a legal document that sets forth, what happens with respect to warranties and representations and limitations of liabilities and remedies. And that's all important if you've got to leverage it. But the document that you're going to go back to, the document that is going to manage that implementation project on a day-to-day basis, is really the statement of work. And in that document, you have to ensure that you include as much detail as possible. You have to have deadlines. You've got to have milestones. You've got to have a user acceptance testing process that says something like, okay, the deliverables are going to be delivered on this day. We're going to have a 2-week process to review to make sure that they are consistent with mutually agreed upon specifications for that deliverable. And if they don't substantially comply with those specifications, there's got to be a process that details what happens. You send it back, they get another try, they redeliver it to you. What if it doesn't comply with the specs again? Then what happens? Do you get a refund? Do you give them another bite at the apple? Do you terminate the contract? Do you get a discount? Do you not pay for the services that are associated to bring it in line with the specifications? What if they can't? All of that needs to be detailed with a very high level of specificity in the contract. And then I think to some extent, you want to have a plan for software customizations. You want to make sure that you understand, what customizations that you think you might need. You want to have some sort of an estimate as to the cost associated with those, and really have an understanding of what business process or business requirement they're going to address. So, the goal is use the statement of work and the contract framework generally as a tool to manage the vendor, because the ideal is, you want to be able to put your feet up on your desk. The vendor's going a little bit sideways. You want to pull that contract out from a drawer. You want to be able to point to some certain provisions and say, no, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're contractually obligated to do. And this is what you are going to do. Because I think that just serves to protect you. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, and Marcus, real quick here, it looks like we had a question in the comments that talked about finding a balance between standard and customization. Can you just elaborate from a contractual standpoint, maybe cover some best practices on how to find that right balance?
Yeah, and I think that's a real kind of gray line, right? Because I think the vendor is going to sell the software system as an out-of-the-box, off-the-shelf system that's just going to work and is going to meet your needs. And we know that's not true. I think ideally what you want to do is keep your customizations to a minimum, because if you go the route of Barrett Business Services, BBSI, and you're doing $33 million in customizations, that's just a recipe for disaster, right? You have to take a measured approach. And I think the customizations should only identify, the customizations that you identify should only serve to address the business requirements that are the most important, the functionality gaps that are the most important to be addressed. So I think taking a measured approach and understanding what you're getting into before you actually get into it is the way to go. That to me is a best practice from the contractual side. Get an estimate as to how much it's going to cost, what the specifications are going to look like. Ideally, have it all mapped out before you even sign the contract. That would be the way to do it. I think that's hard to do. I think it's in some ways unrealistic because the vendor is not going to want to invest that time. But there's ways around that. I mean, if you have to pay them to do some kind of deep analysis or deep dive on the front end, it's going to save you money on the back end, because what you don't want is a train wreck of an implementation, right? You don't want something that's just speeding down the tracks. Customizations are spinning off left and right, and you're just spending more and more money. That's how I would address it.
Yeah, definitely. And just to build on that, I think adding a partner like Third Stage or working with an independent technology agency is definitely a good step in making sure that you're garnering those best practices through years of experience when going through this process. Because like you said, it can be complicated.
And I think that's a great point, because there's resources out there, and I think if you're trying to go it alone, that's not a recipe for success, right? I think if you've got somebody on your team that's really going to be able to help you manage the process, understand what the modifications and customizations are, you're really setting yourself up to have a successful project. Okay, so those are kind of the general lessons, right, of how things go off the rails. So what do you do if you're facing a lawsuit? Okay, first, litigation has to be your last resort. Okay, how much does it cost? Well, it really depends. These are complex commercial cases that are nuanced, that have millions potentially of documents that have to be reviewed by teams of attorneys. One case that we are involved in now, ERP failure case, not the LK case, but another one, we've actually hired a team of independent contractor attorneys to do document review. There's about 40 of them, and it's not inexpensive. Okay, they're doing issue tags, they're highlighting hot documents. I mean, these things are massively expensive. I think you should reasonably expect to spend in legal fees anywhere between $300,000 on the low end, all the way to $1 million if something goes all the way to trial. So I think you have to do whatever it takes to get that software system to work for you, because the alternative is not going to be pretty. You're going to spend upwards of $1 million and be involved in litigation and depositions and testifying for maybe 2 to 3 years easily, and that's not a fun thing. I think you've got to have an understanding, really, that the contract that you think you negotiated with your vendor is probably way worse than you think it is. Okay, the limitation of liability is probably going to give you a year of fees paid prior to the lawsuit. They're probably going to be limited to software fees. You probably paid the software fees on the front end and haven't paid anything in the last year. So your ability to recover anything from them is probably nominal. Okay. We've developed techniques over the years to try to get outside the four corners of that contract and get real relief for our clients. So there's ways to do it, but you're probably fighting an uphill battle. Okay. The warranties are going to be minimal. The remedies associated with that are probably nominal. Maybe you just get to terminate the contract. Maybe you get some kind of refund if you're lucky. You probably don't. Maybe they say you can sue us. None of those are ideal, right? And again, like I said in the beginning, there's usually blame on all sides, right? There will be a tipping point, and in the cases that we take on, the tipping point is usually the fault of the software vendor, not the client. But there's always going to be a tipping point as to where this thing was beyond repair. But without a doubt, there will be blame on your side, and you will have done something that you could have done better. And then finally, success is it's not guaranteed. I think if you take the same case to 10 juries and you've got the best facts, 7 are going to find against you, or excuse me, 7 will find against for you, but 3 will find against you, and you don't know what jury you've got. So that's problematic. Let's go to the next slide. Just to add to what I said, I think it's preferable to focus your energy on getting the system to work, right? You don't want to spend unnecessary money on lawyers. The litigation process is incredibly stressful. And I think, like I said, you've got to do everything that you can to get that system to work and to try to avoid litigation, because you don't know what you're getting into. You don't know what you're going to end up with. Guaranteed, you're going to have a large legal bill, and you might have to, also pay the vendor for whatever damages they're asserting against you. Let's go to the next slide. To add on to what I said, these vendor contracts are always going to be one-sided. Okay, they limit their liability to next to nothing. I think the likelihood you're going to have to litigate in another state with attorneys that you're not familiar with, you're going to get home courted. That's how they design the system, and these are clauses that people don't think about on the front end. So the contract is going to work against you in litigation. Let's go to the next slide. I think before you really contemplate getting into litigation, you've got to do, kind of a deep dive into what you have done and understand the liability that it potentially creates for you. Okay, because every case, the vendor is going to point the finger at you. They're going to say that you didn't make decisions quickly. You didn't have an understanding of the technology. You weren't involved. You weren't fully committed. You weren't dedicating the right kinds of resources. You didn't understand what your business requirements were. And there's probably going to be some level of truth to that. And that makes the case that much more difficult. Okay. And guaranteed, there are going to be things that you could have done better, that you didn't do, that you should have done. Let's go to the next slide. I think certainly, it goes without saying that, the likelihood that you're going to win flat out in a trial is not high necessarily. If you've got the best facts, maybe you will, but you certainly don't know what kind of jury you're going to get. And I think you've got to define what success looks like to you. If you're looking for, a total victory where you're going to get all your money back and you're going to get consequential and indirect damages for the cost of your replacement system, that happens, but that certainly is not the most likely outcome. Okay, I think most likely is that you're going to try to settle this on some basis where you get some amount of money back. Maybe there's some sort of discount, on ongoing maintenance to get you to a new system. There's going to be maybe some money that's provided to you that's going to go to the cost of a replacement system potentially. There's a variety of different ways to deal with this, and I think if you're defining success in litigation as an all-out court victory, you're going to be sorely disappointed. The fact of the matter is most cases settle, and they settle on a basis that is short of what your ideal is going to be, and they settle primarily because there's so much uncertainty involved in the situation. And I think it's better if you're involved in litigation to take the reins and control the outcome and take it out of the jury's discretion, where they may not believe everything that you're saying, and they may say, well, you should have known what you're getting into. Buyer beware, right? Let's go to the next slide. So it looks like there's some additional questions. We'll answer those. If you have any questions about any of the information that I've talked about today, feel free to touch base with me via email or on any of my social channels here. I'm happy to talk about all this stuff. I find it incredibly interesting. I hope you do too. But again, I think the key takeaways from this really, I hope, are for you, have an understanding of what it takes to be successful. Try to avoid litigation. It's not something that you're going to want to get involved in.
Yes, Marcus, thank you so much for taking us through this. I think these are such important lessons. And like Marcus said, if you do have questions, just a reminder, we are garnering all of the questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just go ahead and ask you one of them. And then we'll take a short break, and then we'll go across the pond to Stuart, who is ready to go. So I think this is a great question when it comes from Karen. When you're talking about a large upgrade in implementations, how soon do you involve the users to make sure that you are, contractually touching on all of those lessons that you referenced?
I think involving the users from the earliest stage that's practical is the way to go, because I think the more input that the users have into what they want the system to look like and what their business requirements are, the better off you're really going to be. I think early involvement is key, and it's just not limited to users too. There's an old saying in my business that early legal advice is not expensive, right? So the earlier you get people involved, whether they're experts or users, who I would deem to be experts in the system anyway, the better off you're going to be on the back end. Because what you don't want is surprises, right? There's big gaps in functionality. There's business requirements that you didn't know about. That's not a good position to be in. So I think the earlier the better. But I think use a rule of reason too. You've got to be practical about it, right? You've got to have maybe a team of super users that are the most knowledgeable, that you're limiting limiting the interaction to just them or the involvement to just them. You don't want to overpopulate that environment either.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for all of this really valuable insight. We're incredibly grateful for your expertise here. And if you do have additional questions for Marcus, like I said, just post them in the questions and we'll take them back and then get in contact with you or contact him for you. With that, we'll go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break. So I have our next presenter up here. So we'll, like I said, go across the pond and look at some frontier technologies and digital transformation with Stuart, and then we'll have more of a panel discussion. So everyone could report back here at 1:07 Eastern Time US. We'll see you then.